therapy? The voice that almost died, Julio Iglesias' throat surgery gamble. The doctor's words hung in the air like a death sentence. Senor Iglesias, if we operate, there's a 50% chance you'll never sing again. If we don't operate, the nodules will destroy your voice within 6 months. Either way, your career as a singer is probably over. Madrid, October 1974. Julio Iglesias sat in Dr. Antonio Garcia's consulting room, staring at X-rays of his own throat. The images showed what he'd been denying for months: vocal nodules. Small, hardened growths on his vocal cords, caused by years of singing without proper technique, pushing his voice beyond its natural limits, performing night after night, without rest. He was 31 years old. He'd released 4 albums. He was becoming a star in Spain and Latin America. His voice, that smooth, romantic instrument that made women swoon and men envious, was the foundation of everything he'd built since the car crash 11 years earlier had taken football from him. And now, that voice was dying. The warning signs had been there for months, small at first, a slight hoarseness after concerts that wouldn't quite fade, a raspy quality in the morning that lasted longer each day. Notes he could hit effortlessly 6 months ago now required strain. His vocal range was shrinking, the high notes disappearing first. Then, the smooth transitions between registers turning rough and uncertain. His manager, Alfredo Fraile, had noticed. "You sound tired," he'd said after a concert in Buenos Aires in August. "Maybe you need a break." But Julio couldn't afford a break. He had tours scheduled through 1975, recording contracts. Momentum was everything in the music industry. Stop moving and you disappear. Someone younger, fresher, with an undamaged voice would take your place. So he pushed through. Cortisone injections before shows to reduce inflammation. Whiskey and honey remedies his grandmother swore by. Shorter concerts. Songs rearranged in lower keys. Anything to avoid the truth he could feel every time he opened his mouth. Something was fundamentally wrong. The diagnosis came after a performance in Barcelona, where his voice cracked mid-song. Not a slight waver, a complete break, his voice splitting into 2 tones like a teenager going through puberty. The audience noticed. The band noticed. Julio left the stage early, claiming illness, and flew back to Madrid the next morning. Dr. Garcia was Spain's top laryngologist, the man opera singers trusted with their instruments. He performed the laryngoscopy, a camera down Julio's throat. Intense silence. When he pulled the scope out and showed Julio the photographs, there was no need for explanation. The nodules looked like small white pearls attached to his vocal cords. Beautiful and deadly. "How long have you been singing with these?" Dr. Garcia asked. "I don't know. Months? Maybe a year?" "You're damaging yourself every time you perform. The nodules create friction. Every note you sing makes them worse. Eventually, they'll cause permanent scarring. Your voice will be permanently damaged, rough, weak, unreliable. What are my options?" Dr. Garcia pulled out a chair and sat down. This wasn't going to be a quick conversation. Option 1. Complete vocal rest. 6 months of absolute silence. No singing, minimal speaking. Let the nodules potentially resolve on their own. Success rate? Maybe 20%. Most likely, they're too developed. You'd sacrifice 6 months of your career and still need surgery anyway. Julio's mind raced through the implications. 6 months of silence meant canceled tours, broken contracts, disappointed fans, lost momentum. In 6 months, someone else would fill the void he left. Option 2. Microsurgery. We go in, remove the nodules with laser precision. It's delicate. The vocal cords are incredibly sensitive. Millimeters of tissue that vibrate hundreds of times per second to create sound. One mistake, one tremor of my hand, and you could have permanent scarring, paralysis, complete voice loss. What's the success rate? For retaining some ability to speak, 90%. For returning to professional singing at your current level, 50-50, maybe less. I can remove the nodules, but I can't guarantee your voice will be the same. The scar tissue alone will change your sound. You might lose range, power, control, the warmth that makes your voice distinctive. Julio felt his chest tighten. So you're telling me I have a 50% chance of ending my career if I have surgery, and a near certain chance of ending it if I don't? I'm telling you that you've been singing on borrowed time for months. The only question now is whether you want to gamble on surgery or accept the slow deterioration. For 3 days, Julio didn't speak. Not out of medical necessity, but because he couldn't bear to hear his own damaged voice. He sat in his Madrid apartment, staring at gold records on the wall, listening to his own albums and hearing what the public couldn't yet hear. The subtle degradation, the slight roughness creeping into even the studio recordings. He thought about the car crash in 1963, how he'd lost football and found music, how the guitar a nurse gave him during his 18 months in the hospital had saved his life, how singing had become his identity, his escape, his purpose. And now it might all be taken away again. His father, Dr. Julio Iglesias Puga, came to visit on the second day of silence. The old man who'd wanted his son to be a physician, who'd doubted the singing career, who'd eventually become its proudest supporter. Whatever you decide, his father said, I'll support you. But don't make the decision from fear. You faced worse than this. You learned to walk again when doctors said you wouldn't. You can face this too. Julio made his decision on the 4th day. He would have the surgery. He would gamble, because living with a dying voice, watching it deteriorate performance by performance, was not living at all. Better to risk everything for a chance at keeping what he loved than to surrender to slow death. Dr. Garcia scheduled the surgery for November 15th, 1974. 2 weeks to prepare. 2 weeks to get his affairs in order, as if preparing for actual death. Julio canceled his entire 1975 tour schedule. Millions of dollars in guaranteed income, gone. His record label was furious. Contracts would be broken. Lawsuits were possible. He didn't care. If the surgery failed, none of it would matter anyway. He spent those 2 weeks writing letters to his children, Chibeli, Julio Jr., and little Enrique, barely old enough to understand, to his mother, to friends. Not goodbye letters exactly, but close. Letters that said, if I can't sing anymore, know that the music meant everything to me. November 15th, 1974. Hospital Clínico San Carlos, Madrid. Strong. Julio lay on the operating table, staring at the ceiling. General anesthesia for throat surgery was risky. They needed him semi-conscious, able to follow commands, able to make sounds so they could monitor the vocal cords in real time. Dr. Garcia appeared above him, masked and gloved. We're going to put you under twilight sedation. You'll be conscious, but detached. I'll ask you to make sounds periodically. Don't try to speak. Just hum when I tell you. Can you do that? Julio nodded. Good. See you on the other side. The drugs entered his bloodstream. The world went soft and distant. The surgery took 4 hours. Julio would remember fragments, bright lights, the sensation of instruments in his throat, Dr. Garcia's calm voice asking him to hum, the strange vibration of his own vocal cords under assault, the terror of making sound and not knowing if it was the last sound he'd ever make. But mostly, he remembered the silence in his mind. The place he retreated to while his voice hung in the balance. The realization that if this was the end, he'd lived more in 31 years than most people lived in 80. the car crash survivor who became a singer, the goalkeeper who became a romantic icon, the boy his father wanted to be a doctor who instead became the voice of love for millions. If it ended here, it had been worth it. He woke up in recovery to Dr. Garcia's face. The doctor was smiling. That had to be good, right? The surgery went well. I removed both nodules cleanly. No major complications. Your vocal cords look good. Julio tried to speak. Dr. Garcia put a hand on his chest. No. Absolute silence for 3 weeks. Not a word, not a whisper, not a hum. Your vocal cords need to heal completely before we know if they'll work the way they used to. Write if you need to communicate, but do not make any sound. 3 weeks of silence is eternity when your voice is your identity. Julio lived those weeks in a twilight state between hope and dread. Friends visited, spoke to him, got written responses on a notepad. His children came, confused why Papa couldn't talk. His mother prayed. His father, ever the physician, checked on him daily, monitoring healing progress with professional detachment that barely masked parental terror. Every morning, Julio would wake up and fight the urge to test his voice. Just one small sound, just to know. But Dr. Garcia's warnings echoed. Premature use could cause permanent damage. Patience was the only option. On day 18, he woke up choking on phlegm. Instinctively, he coughed. The sound that came out was rough, ugly, painful. But it was sound. He sat up in bed, heart pounding. He'd broken the silence rule. But that cough, awful as it was, had been produced by his vocal cords. They worked. Damaged, changed, unknown. But they worked. December 6th, 1974. 3 weeks and 1 day post-surgery. Dr. Garcia's office. The follow-up laryngoscopy. The moment of truth. Your vocal cords have healed remarkably well, Dr. Garcia said, reviewing the images. The scar tissue is minimal. Better than I expected. But healing and function are different things. We need to test your voice. How? Carefully. Start with humming. Just a gentle hum. Middle range. Don't push. Julio took a breath, opened his mouth, and hummed. The sound that emerged was thin, shaky, uncertain. Nothing like the Julio Iglesias the world knew. But it was there. A sound. A note. The beginning of something. Good, Dr. Garcia said. Now try a scale. Very gently. Do, re, mi, fa, sol. Stop if you feel any pain. Julio sang. Slowly. Carefully. Each note a question mark. Do, shaky but there. Re, a little stronger. Mi, crack, wobble, recover. Fa, smoother. Sol, almost normal. Dr. Garcia was nodding. Your range is there. The tone is different. Rougher. But that might improve with time and therapy. Or it might be your new sound. Either way, you can sing. The question is, can you sing professionally? 6 months of vocal therapy followed. Not singing, but vocal rehabilitation. Learning to use his repaired instrument correctly. Proper breathing techniques he'd never learned before. Warm-ups, exercises. Slowly, gradually finding his voice again. It was different. That was undeniable. The smoothness was gone, replaced by a slightly huskier quality. His range was reduced. Some high notes were lost forever. The effortless power he'd once had required more work now. But it was his voice. Changed, scarred, but alive. June 1975. Studio recording session. Julio's first time singing professionally since the surgery. The song was Untold Galicia, a ballad that required emotion more than technical perfection. The band watched nervously. The producer hovered over the mixing board. Alfredo stood in the corner. Fingers crossed. Julio sang. The voice that came through the speakers was different from the pre-surgery Julio. Rougher, more vulnerable. There was a rasp that hadn't been there before, a lived-in quality that actually added emotional depth. When he finished, the studio was silent. Then the producer hit the intercom. That was perfect. Whatever happened to your voice, Julio? I think it made you better. Song. The public never knew. When Julio returned to performing in late 1975, critics noted that his voice had matured, developed more emotional depth. Some said it was deeper, richer, more masculine. No one suspected he'd been gambling with his entire career 6 months earlier. The albums that followed, El Amor, Soy, Emociones, became his biggest hits yet. The new voice, with its slight roughness and vulnerability, resonated even more powerfully than the smooth perfection before. Sometimes, Julio said years later, in one of the few interviews where he acknowledged the surgery, losing something forces you to find a better version of yourself. My voice after the surgery wasn't the voice I had before, but it was more honest, more real, more me. The vocal nodules could have ended everything. The surgery could have destroyed everything. Instead, they forced Julio Iglesias to rebuild his instrument from the ground up, to learn proper technique, to find a voice that was his own, rather than the one he'd been straining to maintain. By 1983, when To All the Girls I've Loved Before conquered America, the voice the world fell in love with was the post-surgery voice, the voice that had died and been reborn, the voice that carried the scar tissue of survival. Today, when vocal coaches teach proper singing technique, they sometimes use Julio Iglesias as a cautionary tale. This is what happens when you don't rest, when you push too hard, when you ignore warning signs. Vocal nodules are preventable. The surgery is avoidable. But they also use him as an inspiration. This is what happens when you face the worst and refuse to surrender. When you gamble everything on the chance to keep doing what you love. When you accept that the voice you rebuild might be different from the one you lost, but it can still be powerful. 50-50 odds. That's what Dr. Garcia gave him on that October day in 1974. Julio Iglesias bet on himself, and he won. Not because his voice came back perfect, but because he learned that perfection wasn't what made a voice matter. Survival was, resilience was, the willingness to risk everything for one more song. Strong, the voice that almost died, became the voice that defined a generation. Strong. And somewhere in the scar tissue on Julio Iglesias's vocal cords is the proof. Sometimes the things that break us become the things that make us stronger. P.